Okay, you're on.
That's why I don't drink coffee. I have... There, I'm on. So, if this is why I don't need to scream at you and affluent, whatever we call it.
Aerosol.
Aerosol. I don't want all that to spray over you. So, welcome all. Thank you for all the adjustments you're having to make. I was so anxious to get us back together, and I think some of you are anxious too, which tells me you need to get a life. Just saying. I agree. Okay, good. There might be a couple more folks who are waiting on yet, so I'm going to do some business here. I've only been asked 47 times, what is tuition? Again, tuition for this year, because we ended last year, so without, giving a good product, we weren't paying St. Anthony's for food. We thought we'd give you a rebate. So this year tuition is $250. $250. Now you may already have paid something on that, because when I asked you to send in your application, it asks for a down payment. Some of you did, many of you did not. So that's okay. And I've got the total of what you can ask me if you don't know what you paid or have paid, and I can tell you. All right. So then your books are here. Please, not right now, but please come and take your books. I don't want to have to haul them back. If there are people who aren't here today, whom you know, who have books, ordered books, please feel free to take them if you would like. There's also 2 handouts that you'll need for the class today. The book order, if you take books and want to pay, here is the book order cost. I'm going to call out a bunch of names. Not all of you are here, but during a break today, I would like you to come up and actually fill out an application. I don't have an application for you. And as I've discovered, your phone numbers change, your emails change, and so when I have to communicate with you, I've had difficulty for a few of you. So here are the names of people I don't actually have a new application for. Oh, here are her bells. All right. So Stacy, hi, see what I say, Stacy, Stubby? Yes. Stacy and Pulvers and Tori Pingle and Steve Opodic, and she's not here today, no. John Newmiller, Connie Manlick, Leanne Lella, they're not here today. Alan and Tracy Haugum, Karen Hazy, or Hazy. Karen's a special. She paid $1,000 for coming. You can get the Hazy plan if you like. Jeff Haas, Marie Fleisner, Brenda Erickson, Ja.
Is that you?
Can you say it, Ja?
No.
Ja.
Sia.
Sia. Betty Caldwell, Mark Beratella, Uni Alcott. So come up during break and pick up one of these, and please fill it out. Primarily your email and phone number, and place it in the little bin. That will be very helpful to me. All right? While we're going to doing background stuff, lunch today at 11 o'clock, we'll have a break because I got to run to Subway. Most of you, I hope I didn't mess things up like I did in June. We'll see when it comes. I'll talk later today. My idea is we'll switch a couple different places in town. So if Subway's not your thing, it's not like, oh my God, every month it's the same thing. So we'll talk about that later. The small groups will be, like we did in June, a large group. We'll make it a large group. And just because I just, given the circumstances, in order to each have enough space for you to have, maybe as things progress, if we make progress on our response to this virus thing, we're able to move in that direction. But for now, we're going to do the small groups in a large group fashion. Okay? I think that's it. Any questions? Any questions?
Thank you.
Well, good. Have a good day. It's been great. All right. Let's pray. Jesus Christ, you traveled through towns and villages, curing every disease and illness. At your command, the sick were made well. Come to our aid now, in the midst of the global spread of the coronavirus. Heal those who are sick. May they regain their strength and health through quality medical care. Heal us from our fear, which prevents nations from working together and neighbors from helping one another. Heal us from our pride, which can make us claim invulnerability to a disease that knows no borders. Jesus Christ, healer of all, stay by our side in this time of uncertainty and sorrow. Be with those who have died. Be with the families of those who have died and those who are sick. Defend them from illness and despair. Be with doctors, nurses, researchers, all who seek to heal and help those affected who put themselves at risk in the process. Be with the leaders of all nations. Give them the foresight to act with charity and true concern for the well-being of the people they're meant to serve. Whether we are at home or abroad, surrounded by many suffering from this illness, or only a few, stay with us, Jesus, as we endure and mourn, persist and prepare. In place of our anxiety, give us peace. Jesus Christ, heal us. We ask through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay. Now, I should have said earlier, of the group that we had, some have fallen by the wayside. That always happens. People discover, well, they have health challenges, or a situation in their life. Or, as many find out, particularly when we went virtual, it's hard to self-study. That's why we have schools. If we could all self-study, we wouldn't have to have schools. But self-study it requires a lot more stamina than everybody has. So we've lost some people for that reason. I did offer, remember, if because of your age or your underlying health situation, if you're not feeling comfortable coming back to a group like this, we're allowing you to continue virtually. Though I really think it's not ideal, but I'm a Neanderthal when it comes to education, and so I think there will be 8 or 9 of our group who will stay home until maybe the vaccine is proven successful, and then they'll rejoin us. The rest of you who are here, you will get your 2 skips like usual, huh? But if at any point you feel, because of your health or the health of someone at home, you need to stay home, just let me know. We'll make that allowance. This is a peculiar year. I don't want to lose you. But again, recognize it's difficult to study. It's difficult to study alone. In fact, I made the people who couldn't be here write a little note saying what they're going to watch, and they're going to send their stuff in and assign it, so I can say, see, I told you. Told you. All right, so let's begin. First, I think you will find this year just a heck of a lot easier. First, because it's the second year, and you have, given yourself to this work, and you've begun a habit of study. But secondly, because we're using ground that's more familiar in reading New Testament. And the Gospels to start, and Mark's Gospel first of all. We begin with Mark, which might not have been an obvious choice and for you if you were going to say where we were going to start. You might have your own favorite, or you might have said, well, Matthew's first in the Gospel. In the New Testament, let's use Matthew. But now by doing your background reading, Now you understand why the pedagogy of the course, the people who designed the course, thought it best to start with Mark. It requires a little background. Remember, the New Testament, like the Bible itself, isn't just a book. It's a library. Rather than singing with a single voice, it's more like an orchestra or a chorus. Many different tones and different timbres. You can get more, I think, out of the music of the piece if you learn to develop an ear for the different voices. So rather than just grinding the New Testament into a single story, that was done by somebody back in the 2nd century. They put the 4 Gospels into one, made it a single story. And the church in time called it, they said this is not to be read. Okay, they didn't burn it, but they said this is not what we do. Huh? So there was a version of the Gospels blended together, very popular, particularly among Syrian Christians. And the church in time said, no, let's not go there. Because each of the evangelists, like a voice in a choir or like an instrument in the orchestra, has a particular message to hear. So we're going to read the Gospels. This year we're going to read Mark first, and then Luke, and then John, and then in year 4 we're going to be reading Matthew. And read them separately so that you can get accustomed to their voice. The word gospel is Anglo-Saxon. Now, I know you all can't see the board here, so I'll write just a very few things. And so during break, you can come up and try to unscramble what I wrote, because I know my penmanship is atrocious. The Greek word is Evangelion. EU is the root for the word good, like euphony, euphonium. There aren't too many other English words I can think of that have EU in them, but it's the Greek word for good. And angelion, like the word angel. Okay? An angel is a messenger. That's really what an angel is. People were called angels long before we knew about characters with wings. Okay? So in the ancient Greek world, a messenger was an angelion. And that's what an angel is. Evangelion is the messenger, the message of good news. Okay? The one who brings good news. In Anglo-Saxon, that was rendered good spell, like spelling, the class you had in grade school, and God like good, like goodbye. God be with ye. God be with ye is the etymology of goodbye. So gospel is an Anglo-Saxon rendering of the same meaning. Good news, good spelling. Huh? The New Testament has 3 different meanings or usages of that word that it's kind of good to understand. The first is Jesus. If you have Mark's Gospel open, I hope, because we're going to read Mark first. Get Mark open. Huh? When Jesus begins his ministry, he announces the good news of God. Chapter 1, verse 15. I'll read it in my RSV. The time is fulfilled. The kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel. But it's the word evangelion, believe in the good news. Now, when Jesus says believe in the good news, he doesn't mean... Where'd it go? Oh, underneath here. Sorry, right underneath. He doesn't mean this book. When Jesus says believe in the gospel, gotta stop, think. There is no gospel book yet, huh? The gospel, the story of Jesus, will be written after his death and resurrection. So when Jesus announces, believe in the gospel, he's not thinking the book. He's thinking what God is up to. God's good news. God is up to something new. Okay, so when Jesus uses the word, that's what he means. God, the Father's new good thing. In other parts of the New Testament, the good news is not just about God the Father, it's really about Jesus. The good news about Jesus. So you don't need to look it up, but you can write down the reference if you want to check it later. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. St. Paul writes, this is verses 1 and 2. Now, I would remind you, brethren, in what terms I preach to you the gospel, which you received, in which you stand, by which you are saved, if you hold it fast, unless you believed in vain. When Paul talks about the gospel, he doesn't mean the same thing that Jesus meant. Why? Because now Jesus is part of it. All right? When Jesus says gospel, he means the Father's plan. When St. Paul uses the word gospel, he is thinking differently. He's thinking about the work of Jesus, primarily the work of Jesus. All right? And then the third usage is the one that you're most familiar with. That is, the gospel is a particular literary form that tells the story of Jesus. So when we talk about the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of Matthew, that's the book, that's the writing, okay? So now that might seem like, so what? Well, just you got to be careful. When Paul talks about the gospel, he's not talking about the book. The book has not been written yet when Paul begins his ministry, likely. So we've got to be clear. In general, the gospel, Jesus' proclamation, the gospel is God's good news. After Jesus, Paul and the church proclaim the good news about Jesus or of Jesus. And eventually, people have written the story of Jesus and called it as well a gospel. There are a variety of compositions over the centuries that use that title, not just the four in the New Testament. There are other writings that are called gospel, but these four are singular, unique, and canonical. What kind of writing is the New Testament? I think if I asked you, you just would say biography, and you're partly right, but you're partly wrong. Think about all the stuff that a biography, a modern biography at least, we would count on having. Nobody knows what Jesus looks like. Oh, I know you've got statues and pictures and icons, but really, we don't know what he looked like. We don't know what color his eyes were, which is why artists over the years have tended to make him look like the people that they're creating the art for. Okay? If you're in Europe, surprise, Jesus has blue eyes, if you're Polish. Okay? If you're from Africa, he's got dark skin, black colored eyes. Huh? If you're from Asia, and there's nothing wrong with that. The artists want to they want to say God became human, and since I'm creating this piece of art for somebody in this locale, I will use this kind of judgment about body type. But, we don't know, where did Jesus go to school? What happened to his dad? Where did Joseph go? I mean, there's a ton of stuff we would love to have. What did Jesus do between 12 and 30? And a biography would really want to give us all of that. So while the Gospels are biographical, in that they're telling a life story, they're more than that. And people have written tons of books about this. You think it's a simple topic, but it's really kind of complicated. Scholars today would come down to saying that a gospel is a special subtype of an ancient category that we call cult legend or encomium or laudatory biography. That last couple of words is easier to understand. What's an encomium? Look it up. But a laudatory biography that is praising a person, accentuating their life and works. But for a reason. The evangelists are salespeople. Okay? They're not objective historians. History since the end of the 18th century has tried to claim some objectivity. Now, there is no such thing today. You'll hear there's really no such thing as an objective history. We all bring biases into the stories that we tell. But the gospel writers particularly didn't see themselves as even trying. They didn't see objectivity as necessarily a good thing. If I've discovered a shampoo that keeps my hair its natural color and from falling out, and I don't tell you about it, what kind of a friend am I? Huh? I should be pushing this stuff on you. And the early church found in Jesus something far better than a magic shampoo. Okay, so the evangelist, here's the end of John's Gospel, the 20th chapter, verses 30 and 31. This is the evangelist John reflecting on his work. He writes, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. That is what John thought he was doing. He wasn't saying, I'm going to tell you everything about Jesus' upbringing, parentage, education, DNA, happenstance. No. Again, that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. That's why I think that phrase, laudatory biography, covers it. He is trying to tell us the story of Jesus, but he's trying to sell us on Jesus. Here's another way of understanding what kind of writing the gospel is. A faith account of the Christian community's understanding of the meaning of the life of Jesus. Again, a faith account of the Christian community's understanding of the meaning of the life of Jesus. And this is important because there will be others who will say it's simply merely history. Merely history. There's challenges with that, and we're going to see just in a few moments. On the other hand, there'll be people who say, oh no, it's all fairy tale, it's all made up. Now, so you're going to find people on all extremes. What I provided you is the Christian community's vision. The so-called scientific or modern study of the Gospels began with the development of the canon, C-A-N-O-N, the canons of history in the era called the Enlightenment. Again, think Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, that era. Seeking the story through rational detachment. Okay? Remember Officer Friday? Those of you who are old enough? Just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. Now the problem is, all of us color, just the facts get colored by where we were, or what we saw, and whether we're a woman or a man, or what we think about person's skin color, or whatever. Huh? Just the facts are a very difficult thing. But the canons of Enlightenment history are trying to get as clear as possible, and it's limited, detachment from emotion or authority to what can we objectively show. Okay, so in a mass with little children, sometimes the presider will engage in a kind of dialogue and ask children the answer, and children will always raise their hand and think the answer is Jesus, Jesus. No, sometimes Jesus is not the answer, okay? A modern historian wants to say, let's just take the Jesus piece and set it over here right now. Because modern history wears a set of glasses that says we're not going to run to authority or spirituality or Now, by which we're not saying these things don't exist, but for our work, we're going to just emphasize what we can tell causally. So if you take a history class and the question is, what caused the Civil War, Jesus is not the answer. You have to try to evaluate based on movements in people and the economy and slavery. And so modern history, even historians who believe in God will say, let's bracket God out of it. Okay? Because now, since the Enlightenment, because there were Enlightenment figures, all of them believe in a spiritual world. Huh? So when we talk about modern history, it's not the same kind of communication as the Gospels. The first attempt at a modern history, kind of bracketing the spiritual sort of piece, was written in the late 1770s. Even as our country, our ancestors were fighting for their independence from Britain, a man named Reimarus, R-E-I-M-A-R-U-S, was writing a book. He was afraid to publish the book, rightfully so, because he knew it would cause an explosion. He just left it as a draft, and one of his students published it as fragments. And what it was an attempt at a scientific, bracket out the divine spiritual piece, story of Jesus. Here's the summary: that John the Baptist and Jesus were really revolutionaries, whose failures led them, and who led their followers to concoct a story that he was risen from the dead. Now, that storyline is going to sound like, I've read something like that, or I've heard something like that. If you have watched The Last Temptation of Christ, or Jesus Christ Superstar, or many of the productions of modern history, and modern writing in history, you will get that. That's out there. So people who talk that way are trying to find a reason for the story. They have taken all the spiritual stuff out because, again, Thomas Jefferson and company, they didn't see evidence of God's presence in working in the world. And so, since the Enlightenment, those things have been bracketed. Again, there are believers who are historians, but in their history books, they bracket the intervention of God by miracles and raising from the dead as something beyond their understanding. So it was you might say skeptics. Let's call them skeptics. Reimarus was a skeptic, a religious skeptic. It is skeptics who began to disassemble the Gospels that led believers to respond to try to explain why the Gospels are to be read and not just pitched aside. So Reimarus, at the end of the 18th century, was the first of many writers. When I was in high school, a hot book was a thing called The Passover Plot. Anybody read it? It was a rehash of 19th century skeptics trying to explain that Jesus' death on the cross was really, when the guy put the wine on the sponge, was really an arranged thing. It was a drug to knock Jesus out. So people thought he was dead. So they would take him from the cross. That's why Joseph of Arimathea was hot to bury Jesus, take him down from the cross, because the drug's only going to last for a little bit. And then they put him in a tomb because they're going to come back and rescue him later. But he woke up before, and that's why he walks out kind of confused. Now, the Passover Plot sold hundreds of thousands of copies in the 60s and the 70s. And there are still, you'll still see it on the History Channel and other such things, such kind of approaches to Jesus that say, let's just take out everything that's spiritual, and what's the story of Jesus? The problem with that is the evangelists would tell you, why would you want to do that? Why would you care? If the things I'm telling you, John would say, if the things I'm telling you didn't really happen, well then what good is Jesus? Who the hell cares if he was just a nice guy? who blessed children and told stories. Let me read those verses from John again. Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. A laudatory biography trying to introduce us to Jesus is the point of the Gospels. Still, having said that, we can't just ignore what skeptics or people who are devoted to modern history, the questions they have. Some of them are your children. Some of them are maybe your spouses. You might be one of those kind of people. For example, if you read the Gospels, you're going to notice there's some tension, okay? Did Jesus drive the sellers out of the temple at the end of his ministry, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke say? Or at the beginning of his ministry, like John says? Did Jesus teach the longer version of the Lord's Prayer, or the Beatitudes, or the shorter version? The longer versions are in Matthew. The shorter versions are in Luke. Which is it? Was there one cup at the Last Supper? Or were there 2 cups at the Last Supper? Luke has 2. Matthew and Mark have 1. What day was the Last Supper? Was the Last Supper, all the Gospels agree it was a Thursday, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke say it was Passover day. John says, Passover, Jesus was crucified on the day before Passover. Did the rooster crow once, like in Matthew, or twice, like in Mark? So now you might think, well, those are incidentals. And in a sense, they are. But people who are hard-eyed about religion say, well, look at your sources. They don't agree with each other. They also noted, these are the kinds of questions that led, and our ancestors in faith thought about these things too, but not many of them. Some of the great minds thought about these, but most people couldn't even read, so they didn't really concern themselves with it. So it is these kinds of questions. Which of the Gospels is, if there's varying accounts, which is closer to the real deal? Which of them is the best witness? That led to the work, the churning in a century and a half of books written, articles published, lectures given, that led to a series of can't do 2 things at once. A series of approaches to reading the Bible that we group together as the historical critical method. Historical critical method. It's not one method, it's a whole variety of things. And its aim is to try to reach back to a earlier written witness. You have a green handout, maybe you picked up. In the box, we're going to look briefly at this from the bottom up. Because when you look at a gospel text, there's a whole series of levels of things to be considered. Stage 6 is the modern text we have. The translation that we hear at Mass, that you read yourselves. Okay, that's stage 6. That's the book you've got in front of you. Stage 5 is translation. Surely you know when I read my Bible, it doesn't connect with yours, huh? Well, which is the right one? Well, there is no perfect translation. And the older the translation is, the more difficult it is for modern ears to hear. So there's the book we have, there's the variety of translations. Before that, we have the preservation of manuscripts. The scripts, the books of the New Testament were handwritten, and we don't have any of the originals. We don't have the Gospel of Mark, written by Mark. We don't have any letter by Paul that he signed and sent. We have copies of copies. And with all the hundreds of copies, there's differences. Sometimes the words are in different order. Sometimes they're spelled differently. Sometimes pieces are missing. Sometimes pieces are added. That's a whole nother study. So translation is a study. Trying to locate which of the manuscripts we have is the most authentic is a whole kind of study. So for example, those of you who, well, most of you are Catholic, all of you are Catholic, I suspect, maybe, one or two. We pray the Lord's Prayer as Catholics, and we end it, And in the Protestant community, they add, "For the kingdom and the power and the glory are yours, now and forever." That doxology appears in one manuscript. It happens to be the manuscript that was used to translate the King James Bible. That's why that addition to the Lord's Prayer is so everywhere in the Protestant world. And we Catholics, our translation is based on something else, on the Vulgate from Jerome back in the 5th century. And he had a manuscript that didn't have that little doxology. So that's the work of manuscripts. Then there's the composition of the Gospels themselves, who, as individual writers, compiled their books. The image I like to use is, imagine you're at a buffet, a big buffet, which you probably are all closed right now. But imagine those great buffets, you pay big bucks and there'd be a ton of food. Well, the evangelists are standing in front of a buffet table of the words and deeds of Jesus. I read you what Mark says at the end of chapter 20. Here's what Mark says at the end, John. Here's what John says at the end of his 21st chapter. "There are many other things which Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." So John is saying, folks, I made a choice. I didn't give you everything. I made a selection. And so each of the evangelists is making a selection of the words and deeds of Jesus. And I can imagine, I don't know for sure, I can imagine the things that was prompting them. Who was their audience? What were the concerns of their audience? What were the evangelists' own issues? We all have our favorite stories of Jesus, and there are things about Jesus says that we don't like, huh? Well, maybe their personal tastes kind of were involved there too. So at that level, the gospel writers each bring a kind of an agenda. Before that, we have the gospel, the pre-gospel, pre-written gospel. We have stories of Jesus that were presented orally, by word of mouth. Again, most people could not read in that day. If you wanted to spread the word, the way to do it broadly was not to write a book. Only the elites read books. But you sent somebody out to talk about it, like a town crier. And that's exactly what Luke, the author of the Acts of the Apostles, that's how he explains it. Paul, Peter, Stephen, Philip, they go out and they proclaim orally. Stories are told orally. Written documents, though, very quickly could have eventually been compiled. And before that, there's what Jesus actually did and said. But if you did your homework for Mark today, one thing you recognize is there's a question mark about the disciples getting who Jesus was. I mean, I think the naive understanding is that every night Matthew flipped open his little book and wrote down the things that Jesus did that day, or the clever things he said. Huh? Jesus, how'd you say that again? Can you put it down? Like a reporter? Well, but in reading Mark already and letting the questions in the book direct you, you realize not everybody's on the same page about Jesus. In fact, you're going to find out in your work for next month that some of the disciples of Jesus were like the biggest dolts. They didn't get Jesus at all until Easter. Until Easter. Easter is the wild card. Nobody was expecting Easter. And you might say, well, how could they miss it? He says I'm going to come back. But the reality is, they don't. They don't. Because when he's arrested, and when some report comes, his body isn't in the tomb, no one says, oh yeah, he told us about that. No, they thought he was stolen. So the disciples during the ministry of Jesus don't, at least as Mark presents it, don't understand Jesus. It's only afterwards. It's after Easter, maybe after Pentecost, that they understand. So this green page is it's meant to slow us up, to recall that people sometimes are very simple about, well, just do what it says, say the black and do the red, that kind of simplistic, fundamentalistic approach, not appreciating that the work of the presentation of the Gospels went through many centuries and many different hands, which complicates things. And we don't like it complicated, do we? We like it simple. But to take the New Testament simply is to simply be wrong. Okay? So, and I know the way that the textbook presented some of this might have been a kind of a surprise or a shock. And I'm not as doctrinaire as the editors of the textbook are. But this is good stuff, Maynard. This is important stuff. Not to lose yourself in the details, but be okay. Be okay in asking questions about the text. So, one thing to notice, and I think I brought something for show and tell. I did. So I've already suggested that the Gospels, they don't tell the same story always, huh? Jesus doesn't always say the same words. Now, don't let that panic you. Here is, for people who have too much time on their hands, this is a chart that maps how each of the evangelists laid out their gospel and how they relate to each other. There's 3 piles of information on this chart. First is, there is stuff that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, by the way, John is not in the picture today, okay? So we won't talk about John anymore. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have the same general information. We call it the triple tradition, okay? 3 different gospels all tell us about Jesus' baptism. They all tell us about his death. They all tell us about he walked on water. They all tell us he fed a crowd with 5 loaves and a few fish. That's the triple tradition. 350 to 370, depending on who's counting, verses make up the triple tradition. On this big chart, the part that's red, or reddish, okay, that's the triple tradition. By the way, the links to the columns, this last column I'm going to fold over. There, that's Matthew is the column closest to me, Mark is in the middle, and Luke is over where my hand is. Huh? So you see the triple tradition. So that's one pile of information. We also have some common material between Matthew and Luke. About 235 verses. It is the blue stuff in the first column and the third column. Notice there's no blue in the middle. Okay? So the red is the triple tradition. Stories about Jesus recorded in all 3 of the synoptics. The blue is the double tradition. The verses that Matthew and Luke tell. And then there is material that's unique to each of the gospel writers. In the column of Luke, where my hand is, it's the yellow. All right? And there is a ton of it. 550 verses. About half of Luke's gospel is unique to Luke. Like what? The Christmas story of the shepherds and the angels. The prodigal son. The way to Emmaus. Okay? A lot of really important stuff is only found in Luke. On the column on this side of my head, that's Matthew. And the new stuff, the fresh stuff here is in white. In white. What would be some examples of that? The visit of the wise men. The parable, next week I think is going to be, the parable of the workers in the vineyard who worked different hours and got paid the same amount. Okay? Much of the Sermon on the Mount is only in Matthew. And in the middle column, you see just a few little bits of green, little tiny bits of green. That's the stuff that's unique to Mark. So what? So what? Well, the fact that there's a lot of similarity and some difference raises a question. The similarities are called the synoptic fact. Synoptic. You already know I love etymology. Optic, like optician. Optician? What's the word? Optician. Not obstetrician. That's the name. Optician. It got to do with your eye. Optic nerve. Optic, huh? Syn means altogether, like symphony. They sound all together. Synoptic means these are the Gospels that generally tell the same story. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the synoptic Gospels. That there is so much similarity is the synoptic fact. How to explain that and how to explain the differences is called the synoptic problem. And I'm going to cut to the chase. There is no solution to the synoptic problem. One of your readings, I think, gave you some charts, I think. Did it not? So, actually, if you look at page 68 and 69 of your textbook, you did look at this, didn't you? Oh, of course. Of course. On page 69, you see what I just spoke about earlier without colors. The size of the Gospels and the black in each of those little charts is the triple tradition. What the stories, the verses that the evangelists have in common. The gray is the double tradition, what Luke and Matthew have in common that Mark doesn't have at all. And the white is the unique. Now there should be some white in Mark. That's why I don't like the book. There's always, there are some things only in Mark. Okay? So, but flip the page over, and there you see a diagram that offers an example, not the example, but an example of the explanation of how this all works. Let me present a couple other possibilities. Now, I am, by and large, I'm okay with this. So I'm not like, but there are people who think this is like, oh my God, it's godless, it's devil, it's the devil's work. Those are people who are afraid to ask questions, okay? Because if they ask questions, it'll challenge their faith. People are asking questions. You yourself are asking questions. So don't be afraid. But let's go beyond the questions to try to understand what's going on. But I'm going to erase the board here. So I said you could check the words later. You can't. They're gone. But because other people have thought this through, this is just the dominant view today. But there's a lot of questions about it. Believe me, not everybody signs on to this. In fact, a big mind from the early church was St. Augustine. Of course, he thought Matthew came first. Now, did he come to that decision himself? We don't know. But he writes about this, and he says Matthew was first, and then Mark must have taken Matthew and given us a freeze-dried version of it. Okay? And Luke came later. He must have known Matthew and Mark, and this explains how come there's a triple tradition, stuff in all three, and a double tradition, where only Matthew and Luke agree. Okay? Now this was his proposal. And this, pretty much, the early church drank this Kool-Aid. This is what you're going to hear when you read the patristic fathers. When you read early church history, I have a copy of Eusebius here. This is the general early church's view. Up until about the 18th century, most people, it made sense. It made sense. There are some problems with it. So for example, if you had Matthew, if you had the Beatitudes, if you had the Golden Rule, if you had, I'm trying to think of some of the other just great stuff Matthew has, would you leave it on the table and when you write a condensed version? I mean, didn't Mark just leave some great stuff on the floor if he's just summarizing Matthew? That's a problem. So I mean, if you want to read, there's books about this and about what could be and couldn't be. We don't have the solution. I just want to show you an example. But notice what Augustine isn't saying. What he's not saying is, here's Jesus, and here's Mark, and here's Matthew, and here's Luke. That they were all like eyewitnesses writing down their stuff. The point I want to make is, even Augustine appreciated that somebody borrowed from somebody. Pull out, did you pick up your synopsis? Yours is a little different than mine, huh? We're not going to talk about this book today, because it's too complicated. I've got to teach you how to use it. That's why I omitted all the questions that asked you to use it. You have to learn about this book before. So pull it out, turn to page 14. Page 14. Up left-hand corner. It should say, at the top, it should say 14, John's preaching of repentance. See that? Now, if you brought your own synopsis and it doesn't, not this one, it'd be a different page. Okay, I just want to note there are 3 columns. Notice, and that what it does here, it produces what the Gospels, the 4 Gospels have about John's preaching. Notice the Mark column is empty. Mark has no teaching from John the Baptist. But Matthew and Luke do. And look at the first sentence on the left, is verse 7. But when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming for baptism, he said to them, just draw a little tiny line, like a little hash mark after them, before you brood. Okay? And then in the 4th line down, which is presume, underline the word presume. Your books just lost half of their value. No, what I want to show you is, now if this was Greek, it would be even clearer, but except for everything before the hash mark and that word presume, Matthew and Luke have the exact same word for word teaching. Word for word. Now, if you taught catechism or 4th grade and 2 students handed in work like that, what would you presume? Now, if it was close but a little different, you'd say, well, they heard the same source. But it's word for word. And in Greek, word order doesn't matter. In English, word order matters. Mark through the chalk versus the chalk through Mark. Doesn't make any sense. Or Mark, chalk through. Makes no sense. Huh? In English, word order matters. In Greek, doesn't matter. In Greek, it's not only the same words, it's the same word order. So that's what led, close the book, that's enough. That's what led scholars and Augustine to say, well, Augustine thinks that Luke didn't have Matthew. But again, that's part of the problem with this theory. There's another theory that moves Luke up here. Matthew had Luke, and Mark had both. See, here, Luke was the bottom item, huh? Luke had the 2 of them. There's an argument, an approach called by men in Griesbach in the 18th century. This was his solution. Okay? So there's a dozen of these. Not to worry about them. What you have in front of you is the dominant theory. And what does it show? It shows that Mark, in the mind of most scholars, came first. Let me make one argument in its favor. So we have the triple tradition. Later on, you can come up and you want to look at this chart. You'll see there's a lot of lines, like the interconnected parts. Matthew and Luke. Okay, when Matthew and Luke are imitating each other, they do not agree where to put the story at the beginning or the end or wherever, unless they agree with Mark. Say that again. When Matthew and Luke agree in the ordering of the stories, they only agree when they agree with Mark, which is an argument for that they both had Mark and that they're copying Mark in order. First comes A story, then comes B story. They might insert some stuff, but they don't put B before A or D before A. They kind of keep the same pattern. Now, again, there are a ton of these arguments, but this is one of them that led to what we call Markan priority. Write that down. Markan priority. Markan priority is saluted by 96.5% of people who study the scriptures seriously. There are still some who say Matthew came first. They tend to be Catholics. They tend to be beholding to the patristic fathers. They tend to love Augustine. Augustine couldn't have been wrong, and so they kind of, they make an argument for Matthew being first. But 96.5% of the scholarly world says Mark came first. Matthew and Luke both had Mark in front of them. Okay? On the right-hand side, you see the letter Q. Now, if you're a Star Trek fan, that means something to you. Or QAnon now is big in politics. Okay, that's not what this Q means. The word, there's a word behind it. The German word, I can flip your book back over, you'll see the German word Quelle, Quelle, on the gray stuff. It was Germans who really led the field with this. Brits came second. But anyway, all this stuff where Luke and Matthew agree, sometimes word for word, like the stuff we looked at from teaching of John the Baptist, there must have been another document, another written document that Luke and Matthew have that we don't have anymore. It was lost. Now again, this is a theory, boys and girls. It's a theory, because we don't have the document. But when they see all these similarities, even word for word ones, like the one I pointed out to you, they think there had to have been another document. They don't know what to call it, so they simply called it document, or actually they call it source. And the German word for source is Quelle. Quelle. Thus, its signature is Q. It's not the Q source. That's like saying the source. It's just the source. This is a theory. Now, Markan priority, 96.5. The existence of Q, 75%. There are problems with it. And again, and that's why you don't need to swallow that. Markan priority, you gotta kind of. The Q thing, not so much. Then you see on the edges, you see M and L, and that just stands for material